So very quickly, what are automatic processes? Intuitively, we know that some behaviors and attitudes feel like they're out of our control. We might not want to do them. They kind of happen to us. So we might want to smoke, eat, or drink less, but we just keep doing that. We might want to be less anxious presentations, but we just are. Maybe we know we should be paying more attention to our partner, but can't manage it. We might want to control our temper better and still fly off the handle. Or maybe we are kind of aware we have stereotypes. We might not like them, but we still have them. So there's kind of a paradox there, is that, well, we know it's doing harm. We might want to stop, but we keep doing it. So what's going on there? So this is something that dual process or dual system models try to explain. And the basic idea of models is, well, we must have two kinds of processes operating in parallel and maybe in opposition to each other. And this is a very old idea that goes back to Plato, who sort of talks about horses pulling us in different directions. But this has been updated in modern science. Right? So you could say, well, maybe this reminds us of Freud, obviously, and we had cognitive approach to this. You had social psychology versions of dual process models. There are lots of variations, but the idea is there's a split between these two kinds of processes. The one kind of process is unconscious, the other is conscious. The one kind is involuntary versus voluntary. It's either stimulus-driven or goal-directed, impulsive versus reflective, fast versus slow, and so on. And this seems to be true. We seem to have these different kinds of processes that we might be able to split up in that way. There is criticism, so I'll come back to that a bit later. So the question is, well, that's a nice idea. How do we get data on such automatic processes? The general approach is to use something called implicit measures. So what are implicit measures? So these are ways of using reaction times and accuracy to try and infer something about automatic processes going on below the surface. One example I'm going to go into is the probe task. So this has been around for a very long time. It's been used in a large amount of studies. And what's the idea? Well, you can see the picture. The idea is in that picture. Sometimes your attention is drawn by something, and maybe it shouldn't be, but you can't control it. You just look at the thing. There are other applications of the probe task. So maybe you might wonder, well, do people with anxiety disorders have some kind of bias towards paying too much attention to negative facial expressions? Maybe you could think, well, perhaps the avoidance of threat stimuli is a predictor of worse outcomes for a patient with PTSD. And you might wonder, is a bias towards alcohol associated with risky drinking? So all sorts of questions that you could hypothesize have something to do with this kind of bias. And to measure that, we have a very simple kind of task. The trials of the task start off with a pair of cue stimuli. In this case, we have a bottle of beer and some water. And the question is, if a probe stimulus that you have to respond to appears at the location of the beer versus the water, are you then faster? Right? So if this happens, you see this is one kind of probe, and I have to respond to that. What if it had appeared at the water location? Would I have then been slower on average to respond to it? If that's the case, then you could say, well, seems like your attention was already drawn towards that one kind of stimulus, and therefore you have an attentional bias. And this has been done in around 800 studies that I found on PubMed in a quick search, and it's been applied very widely, so to risky drinking, anxiety, aggression, all sorts of things. However, there's apparently a problem, because there's a little bit more recently, there's a lot of studies coming out that said, well, we've looked at the reliability of these scores, these bias scores, and it's extremely low. And by extremely low, this can be around 0. It's not even a significant correlation between, say, the even and odd blocks. So there's just nothing there, apparently, that you could use to correlate, right, if there's no systematic effect. This is pretty bad. So it's quite a complex methodological issue, but it's disturbing that it's so low. At least this doesn't seem to it seems very noisy, at least. Further, it doesn't even exist as a general effect, right? So you might say, well, the individual differences are very noisy, but that doesn't mean there might not be a general effect that we could study. But in one big meta-analysis, the researchers looked at about 1,000 patients who are clinically anxious, which means you think, well, they should have a bias towards threat if anybody does. And there wasn't even a bias towards threat in that group. So what's going on, right? So is there no such thing as intentional bias? So was it all an illusion, or is the task extremely noisy? This is a problem. So what could we do to go a bit further to try to address this? Well, some of my recent research has gone into trying to find a different version of the dot probe task that might resolve the issue, primarily by being more reliable. I called that the cued visual probe task with a cVPT. And the idea of this is to use predictive cues instead of these stimulus-driven effects. So what that means is this also involved a bit of a change in the theory, because you could say, well, if it's stimulus-driven, if it's predictive, then it's goal-directed, so it can't be automatic, surely. Well, there were ways to get around that theoretically. There were new theoretical ideas that actually say, well, we need to get past sort of a rigid idea of what automatic process is. For instance, the R3 model, which I can't go into now, but please look that up if you're interested. What this does is, okay, we'll show you predictive cues, and we'll intermix picture trials and probe trials. So on the picture trial, this establishes a predictive value of the cues. You might see, and these are very, very distinct cues. Right? These are made to be very obvious. You'll see, say, a line of blue O's and a line of yellow bars, and after a little while, the blue O's will always be replaced by, say, a bottle of beer or some alcoholic drink, and yellow bars will be replaced by a Fanta bottle, for instance. Yeah, so that means after a while with your training, you know that if I see blue O's, that might be followed up by a nice bottle of beer. And to see whether that affects your attention, if that causes some kind of bias, we throw in the probe trials. On probe trials, you don't see the picture at all. You only see the cue, the predictive cue. Instead of a picture, you get a probe stimulus, which means, well, you have to press the button representing the location of the top. These trials, there's no actual picture. There is that predictive value that you've established. So well, I think there might be some kind of alcohol picture appearing at this location. And then you can check, well, are you quicker to respond to probes at the alcohol location versus the non-alcohol location? Right? So we've done this for alcohol, and it did indeed turn out that you got good split half reliability, 0.7 to 0.8, which is very good for an implicit measure. It's good enough to do correlation analysis with. Furthermore, and this might be, there are various reasons this might happen, but the big one is, well, maybe it's because we're not depending on your response to particular stimuli, particular exemplars of beer, so you might see beer or wine or whiskey, but you're seeing a predictive cue that's predicting a general category of stimuli, and that predictive cue is very visually obvious. Looked at the validity as well. So the bias is it's correlated with whiskey drinking. So we found that in a few studies. It's still, what makes it a bit exploratory is that it's a certain measure, well-known measure of whiskey drinking that shows a correlation. Certain other measures like craving don't show a correlation. So that still needs to be completely confirmed, completely established in a confirmatory study, totally focused on whiskey drinking. But that's currently submitted. Okay, so very briefly, if you're aware of subject of potential bias variability, so only for people who know about ABV, the task lends itself to studying that, and it was found to be related to conflicting associations. So it seems to be a useful kind of task, and it maybe addresses one of these problems. The task has been used for studying threat as well, right? So the previous results for alcohol. There is also a nice general bias towards threat based on predictive cues. It's a little less reliable in an unselected population, but it's not around zero. Again, for further reading, there are some very subtle trial-to-trial carryover effects that we found for more normal kind of dot probe-esque tasks, and these generalize to the predictive cues. So it seems like they're working the same way as natural threat stimuli, but maybe doing a bit better in terms of psychometric properties. Okay, so lots of questions about the cVPT. However, it seems promising. It's at least concerns are current difficult problems. So more generally, maybe the conclusion is we need to take a step back when we talk about all these implicit measures studies. We use implicit measures to maybe perform quite expensive studies on all kinds of topics. But if our tools aren't that good, what are we doing? It's quite costly to go back and say, well, no, actually going to sit down and work on the task again. But maybe it's worth the time. So I'm certainly kind of pleased with having spent some time on this, and found a few sort of examples of ways you can improve these tasks, and then of course you can use them in more sort of applied or maybe in other kinds of studies where you kind of assume the task is doing what you expect it to do, and then you ask questions about something else, like alcohol addiction. Another example, just further reading, emotional go-no-go tasks are very similar. They don't quite work the way you expect them to, but if you tweak the task a bit, actually suddenly you get good effects. So the bottom line I'd say is, well, okay, I think if we can be optimistic, we can measure automatic processes with behavioral tasks, but we might have to have a think about it. And the next question is, can we change automatic processes? So say we have some kind of harmful behavior or attitudes, as we saw in these sort of examples, like you lose your temper, you drink too much, and we think, for whatever reason, maybe this is caused by an automatic process, like an attentional bias. So we want to target those automatic processes. Right? So we might want to test some theory, we might want to actually just use this for clinical purposes. And the CBM is one way to do this that I find interesting. And this basically took implicit measures and turned them into a computer-based training task. I'll show you an example of that in a second. And the question is, well, okay, is it the case that by doing this training task, we can change automatic processes, and those changed automatic processes affect some kind of real-life clinical outcome? I think the most interesting example of this, or the most convincing example of CBM, is for alcohol. So this is what I'm going to focus on. In the original rationale, the idea was, well, if you're addicted to alcohol, you have an automatic approach bias for alcohol. So if you see beer, you'll grab the beer, you'll drink the beer, or you'll go to the shop and buy the beer, you go to the bar and order a beer, or a whiskey, or whatever. So what we want to do in the CBM, in the cognitive bias modification, is to retrain that tendency to approach alcohol. To do that, we show you lots of pictures of alcohol and soft drink, and you have to push away the alcohol via maybe a joystick push and pull the soft drinks towards you with a joystick pull. Right, so that's your task. It's a very simple training. Push away the alcohol, pull towards the non-alcohol pictures. And then the question is, could such a thing be used in addition to treatment as usual for patients, which is usually some kind of cognitive behavioral therapy, to get a better outcome? So this is work I wasn't involved in initially, but the first randomized controlled trials showed a significant decrease in relapse after a year in the patients who did this training. Right? So these are quite nice well-powered studies, and the relapse goes from roughly 60%, almost 60%, down to between 45 and 50%. So that's a clinically significant decrease as well. This is a very stable kind of relapse rate over a lot of years. I couldn't get this lower, but by doing this extra kind of manipulation, you take it down about 10 percent points. Subsequent research is, I can't go into it, but is that we know a bit about the mediating processes. We know a bit about the effects on the brain, how the brain is affected by doing this kind of training. So that's quite an interesting story as a whole. The next step was to try to enhance the training that had been done before by using TDCS. Now, TDCS is a way to stimulate the brain or modulate brain activity using constant current. This has been studied a lot. There's some sort of controversy about it, but the application we were interested in was a possibility that maybe this will enhance neuroplasticity and therefore make the training more effective. So in the study by Denaro et al., published in 2016, we took the patients in an addiction clinic. They were all getting the approach avoidance training because they've been shown to work well, so therefore the people felt like, well, you can't take away their training, but we could say, well, we'll put you in a TDCS condition. So either we'll give you sham TDCS, or we'll give you TDCS at a different time than when you're doing the training, or we'll give you the TDCS during the training. Right? So the idea was, well, if you give you the TDCS during the training, maybe that will boost the training effect because it's making the brain more receptive to the training. And what you see is a nice sort of dose response, is that in the sham TDCS group, we had about 39% relapse after a year. In the separate TDCS group, it was 24% relapse. And for the people getting the TDCS during the training, it went down to 14% relapse. Problem is, of course, these are much smaller groups, but I think this is very interesting. And if this were to replicate in a larger group, and you still get down to 14%, that's a huge improvement in outcome. The region we were stimulating was the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. So you might wonder, well, why would that be relevant? Well, in a neuroimaging study into the effect of the AAT, it was found that one of the changes was in the amygdala, that actually the amygdala response to alcohol stimuli was lower. So that gives you the idea, well, it's not a mediation study, but maybe that has to do with the effect of the training that's making alcohol less salient. Now, in another study, which wasn't involved with alcohol, we found that there's a negative connectivity between the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and the amygdala. Now this is a known effect, of course, or known relationship. So maybe what we're doing is we're increasing the ability to train the DRPFC to downregulate the emotional response to alcohol. So it's not the same theoretical idea as where the training came from, but we kind of learn as we go along. However, so that's a nice, I think, sort of example of the kind of the potential of CBM and where it is. So it needs to be replicated, but there's quite good evidence there that is useful and kind of building a picture of the processes that are involved and why it would work. CBM, similar to implicit measures, very, very widespread, lots of studies. There's one example I'm still involved with that you might use to improve self-regulation, which is applied to anxiety, depression, all sorts of things. However, there have been some relatively recent meta-analyses and earlier critiques that said, well, really, if you put everything together, there's no effect whatsoever. If you take all the CBM studies that have been done, you can cherry pick the nice results, but actually the meta-analysis, which tries to really weigh the results or weigh the studies together, show nothing. Now, of course, that's not the end of the story. There have been a lot of papers going back and forth with the criticism, and then people respond to that. So it's very interesting to read. It's too complex to go into detail right now. I think the bottom line kind of should be, the meta-analysis had a point in that we shouldn't make big claims about CBM in general. It doesn't always work. At the same time, if you chuck all studies in a certain field in one methodological blender, you're also losing a lot of information. Actually, that's probably also not correct to do, is it? I mean, if we want to know if something works, we do have to sort of use a bit of insight into the theory and the designs and what different studies are for. Some studies are more experimental and more speculative than others. Well, if that doesn't work, does it really mean your whole method was that it should decrease your the plausibility of the methods you've used? Also, probably not. So I think going forward, you just need good pre-registered studies making clear, well, we think this is the convincing result, and this is where we're going to go further, and then we're going to just test this properly. So thanks for your attention. The conclusions, therefore, I think we need to invest in improving our implicit measures, the way we measure automatic processes. It's kind of a step back, but the alternatives are probably worse. We can keep going and do lots and lots of applied studies and studies, aimed at social clinical questions, but are we wasting our time? And I just don't think we need to give up on the language search, so where implicit measures are all useless. We need to use eye tracking or something else. No, there are ways we can get reliable results, but we just need to work on that. On changing rather than assessing implicit measures, I think CBM is promising. I think there's a debate going on that really is nuanced. Both sides have their points, but I don't think either side, is totally right here. And especially the combination with TDCS is very interesting. And this is an empirical question: will this replicate? We found some good results, but this needs to be studied further. And in general, we need more research, more replication. But I think we can be somewhat optimistic. Thank you very much.